of qualitative research. Today's program promises to be equally enriching as we delve into the intricacies of fieldwork and ethnography. We have a series of 3 in-depth sessions, each designed to unpack various aspects of qualitative research. And here, for the first session, we have with us Dr. Ratish Kumar, who will be detailing on the presentation of ethnographic data and analysis. Dr. Ratish Kumar works as Associate Professor at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has previously taught at the Department of Anthropology in University of Hyderabad and at the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies at Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. He was a Charles Wallace Trust Visiting Fellow at the Center for Research in Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities at the University of Cambridge from 2021 to 2022. His recent publications include a co-edited book published by Routledge in 2024 titled Practicing Interdisciplinarity, Convergences and Contestations. I once again extend our warm welcome to this workshop, sir, and I now kindly request you to start the session.
Thank you, Dr. Maureen, for that wonderful introduction. I'm a little, concerned about my way of organizing this lecture because you have only 45 minutes to deliver the lecture and there's a Q&A for some 15 minutes. Am I right?
Yes.
I think that's the format. Yeah. So no, I'm slightly concerned about how much I can contain. That's the worry I am carrying. But I'll try my best to organize my lecture around certain core ideas which will be important for ethnography in terms of understanding ethnographic research, how analysis can be centered. That is the purpose of this whole exercise. That's what I'm trying to understand that. And a very good morning to all of you. And first of all, my thanks to the organizers, especially KKH State Open University and Indian Sociological Society to organize this workshop on qualitative research methods. First of all, I would like to start with a slightly provocative statement, which I think you will take it for further thoughts. I have been seeing in last few years there are so many, especially in the post-COVID, and after that you will find so many overwhelmingly organized programs on research methodology, especially research methodology workshops. These are sort of training programs in which young faculty, their early career and research scholars are eagerly participating. Now, I'm stressing this word, eagerly participating, because there is an quest for something like something is missing in understanding our own practices, or we need to learn more, or in the sense that there is an overwhelming focus, as I mentioned, on methods rather than in other areas of doing research, especially in the context of in the domain of theory and concepts. And that's what my focus is on. Why focusing more on methodology or more on methods of data collection and analysis, but a little less on theory and concepts. And this is the central aspect I would like to place before you for further thought process while talking about ethnography's way of presentation and analysis of data or information. I hope I otherwise take it for granted that most of you are well aware of what ethnography is or what ethnography was in the inception phase of anthropology, sociology as disciplines in the 19th and 20th century. And when we are in the 21st century, what kind of ethnography that we are familiar with and what kind of ethnographic practices are found, which are what we call, contemporary ethnographic practices, or, there are several ways of, understanding modalities of ethnography. In the 60s and 70s, we have found something called new ethnography. In the 80s, there is cultural turn, critically looking at literary practices in ethnography. And in the 21st century, we find issues related to multisensorial ethnography, also critical ethnography. So there are several layers to the idea of ethnography as a practice in research. Now, if we go back to the very basics, the premises of how ethnography was conceived as a practice, as a research approach, we'll find I'm taking this from one of the textbooks. You'll find several textbooks and YouTube videos about how what is ethnography and how to practice ethnography. So it's always important to look at the history of practices if we want to go and understand any tradition for that matter. So when we look at ethnography from its basic grounds, ethnography implies a descriptive account, production of a descriptive account on people, cultures, communities based on field work. That is, what we can call face-to-face interaction with the human agents in their own place of existence over a considerable period of time. So that's how ethnography was understood in its scientific way of what we can call explaining or defining it. Now, when we look at ethnography, there are two dimensions. One is ethnography as a set of practices, because when we understand ethno and graphy, graphy means writing or an output of recorded information, and that's how we look at graphy as a final product. Ethnography as a product, that's what we call the ethnographic monograph. So a set of practices leading to the construction or the production of a monograph that is in a written form. Now you will find audio, video forms, and multiple way of expressing how ethnographic data can be communicated. Now, when we look at these set of practices that involves, ethnography involves a number of methods, a family of methods. Ethnography doesn't suggest that it is purely qualitative, but you will find that ethnography is understood as predominantly a qualitative method. That's how the practices were from the beginning to contemporary times. But then, when looking at practices, we'll find there are certain core elements to the practice of ethnography. That is being in the field. A field is understood to be a place which is not of the ethnographer from its historical context. That colonial anthropologists started going to other places, which is called the pre-modern or the primitive in quotes. And then ethnography started shifting its territory in more of urban context, so on and so forth. But then it involves the direct and sustained contacts with human agents, and that suggests that the way of watching what happens, that is observation, and listening to what is said, that are kind of interview methods or conversations, and then asking questions and different sorts of methods. I'm not really going into that because I already told you that I've taken you all for granted that the basics of ethnography. So I'm focusing more on presentation and analysis, where I'll be pitching in a moment. Now, when we talk about modalities of collecting data, it demands a richly produced written document that cannot reduce human experience, or there is an irreducibility of human experience. And that also suggests being an ethnographer, one has to acknowledge the role of theory as well as the role of the researcher. This is the last point, the last point, acknowledging the role of theory, or an ethnography that is informed by social theory and understanding the role of the researcher. So now when we look at these two aspects, there comes the scope for how one can actually translate a mere ethnographic description into an analytical description that carries ethnography along with theoretical and conceptual formulations. Now, in methodology classes, we get to know that when we get into the idea of writing, we have been told that how academic writing is slightly different from journalistic writing, or it is juxtaposed in an oppositional with oppositional tendencies, in some sense that journalistic writing will not really engage, or generally does not engage with theory and concepts, or theories or concepts. And that's how, when we look at ethnographic output, ethnographic monograph, there is always a burden, or there is always a compulsion how conceptual and theoretical orientations can be brought in, or that can be embedded in ethnographic presentation of data. Now, when we look at the debates on theory, concepts, and method in the context of ethnographic research, uh, we assume that ethnographers collect data through different methods, as I already mentioned. Primarily, it started with positivist way of observation in the time of Malinowski and others in the first half of the 20th century. And there's a shift taking place in anthropological and sociological research, where you will find interpretive hermeneutic approach to uh, observation, primarily from Clifford Geertz and others. So you will find there is a theoretical shift taking place rather than a shift in practice per se. So and this is all about how ethnographic data is analyzed and presented before a set of readers or audiences. No, that's why I wanted to stress on the idea of theory, or theoretically informed ethnography, and that suggests that how a mere description can be translated, or converted into an analytical description. Now let's see how ethnographic tradition, or the way in which ethnography was written in earlier times, and how that becomes slightly different in contemporary times. Uh, there was a break, one can actually see in the 1980s, when ethnographic writings were subject to some sort of critical scrutiny. And this was really, exemplified in the collection of essays that we are all familiar with, the writing culture, where Clifford and Marcus put together a bunch of articles which contemplated and critically evaluated what was happening in ethnographic writings. And the basic premise of their understanding is the difference and the distinction between the much claimed scientific way of writing ethnography and the literary modes of expressions which were essentially involved in ethnographic writings since beginning. Now, from 17th or 18th century onwards, Western sciences, Western science actually made some sort of a qualification what all can go into the repertoire of science. I mean, based on observable facts, collection of factual data which can be verified, and which this verifiable data can be converted into generalizable proposition. That's how theory has been made. Theory is a kind of a set of statements or claims which are some sort of an open-ended propositions which can be subjected to empirical assessments and falsification. That's the way in which we understand theory. But when science makes this claim that what could not qualify as scientific, what science excluded by saying that these are unscientific ways of expressing or analyzing, they all found a place in the field that is called literature. And literary ways of expressions are, deemed to be metaphorical, they are allegorical, they are fantasies or imaginations which are not really having some sort of a scientific basis. And this is the turn that uh, makes in some way made sense of what ethnographers or ethnographic writings involved with. So that's the critique that in 1986, when writing culture was proposed, Clifford's introduction suggests that ethnographic writings are basically poetics and partial truths. Now let's examine how the traditions of writing in ethnography can be understood in certain classificatory modes. I'm actually drawing this from Clifford's own propositions that all ethnographic writings are constructed from a particular social milieu. So this is what we can understand as contextuality of ethnographic writing. So there is a context that represents a social milieu, and ethnographers uh, create or draw from these particular social milieux. So it is always informed by certain places and cultures and what we can call a bounded cultural reality. Secondly, ethnographic writings are always rhetorical in nature, and that's what I was talking about. This literary practices intervening in ethnographic research, or otherwise, it in some way influences ethnographic way of writing. So now, when we are talking about rhetoric, it is all about how expressive tropes are used, or the use of expressive tropes, say, for example, metaphors, figurative language, allegories are all used by ethnographic writing. So we are looking at the nature in which ethnography was produced in conventional sense. What are the ethnographic conventions otherwise? And thirdly, when we talk about ethnographic writing, it's all about how institutional characters are reflected in ethnographic writing. Institutional characteristics. Say, for example, ethnographers write within institutional conventions or within disciplinary framework. Sometimes they go slightly against that. It's along with or against institutional structures and disciplinary, frameworks. Fourth, it's about how one can look at specific forms. That's what we call it. How ethnography produces different genres. Say, for example, ethnography can be distinguished from a novel or from an autobiography, and there are you will find certain overlaps when we talk about ethnographic writings when they carry literary modalities. Now, when we move on to further, uh, classificatory modes in which ethnographic conventions can be understood, one of the important or the significant markers of ethnographic writing is how ethnography is politically informed, in the sense that, how ethnographers write politically. Politically means it is not that, it is not simply embedding ideologies in it, but rather how the situatedness of the ethnographer and the ethnographic subjects are unequally placed. In that sense, ethnographers mostly are having that authorized or authoritative kind of a representation that can actually that they can operate while writing about other cultures, other people. And this keeps on changing. And there's also some sort of talking back or resistance that come from ethnographic subjects too. And finally, when we talk about ethnographic writings in a way of understanding historically, all these conventions are shifting into, uh, they all borrow from other domains, disciplines, institutional structures and practices, and they are basically all these conventions are undergoing change. That's why historically one has to understand what we call ethnographic writing. Now, given these characteristics of ethnographic writing, one has to look at how uh, analysis and presentation of the data first can be understood from the perspective of the ethnographer. When I was asked to talk about presentation and analysis of ethnographic data, some of you, may expect that I'm going to give you some sort of a toolkit. This is the way of presenting and analyzing ethnographic data, and there's no such uniformity or universality that I would like to contain in my talk. And there's nothing like a kind of a universal or a uniform practice that should be embedded or that should be brought in as part of a toolkit. I'm not really talking about there is a particular way of presentation or analysis of data. I mean, the idea of analysis and presentation of data, that stems from what kind of theoretical and conceptual orientations through which you become or you belong to uh, in an intellectual space, how theories and concepts are informing you along with your subjective ways of engaging and interpreting people, cultures, and events that you study. Now, first of all, in that way, I actually wanted to shift to the understanding of the role of the researcher, role of the subjectivity of the researcher. Uh, since we talk about presentation and analysis of data, they both these things, presentation and analysis of data, are uh, informed by researchers' subjectivity. When I'm talking about subjectivity, I'm not really restricting subjectivity to one's own identity as such. Identity is part of subjectivity, but it also suggests that how an academic career is shaped through certain theoretical and institutional orientations. Now we know that how institutions shape conceptual and theoretical categories. Now, you are studying in a particular institution, what kinds of theories and what kind of conceptual orientations are part of the tradition and convention, that whether you are joining that convention or you are actually stepping away from that convention, it all depends on how you negotiate and navigate through your institutional traditions and conventions. So that way, we are all shaped and reshaped by certain theoretical and conceptual orientations. So how do we understand that, our potential and our limits, our potential as well as our limits of working with theories and concepts that always make some sort of a baggage in our way of analyzing and presenting data. So when we look at analysis as a process, as I mentioned, there is no such a particular way of analysis I just wanted to endorse over others. Now let's look at analytical practices. If it is more of uh, an analysis that comes from a field called literature, that was quite prevalent in anthropological and sociological writings. We get to know about different sort of analysis, like textual. We will find analysis with several prefixes: textual analysis, content analysis, discourse analysis. You'll find several sort of analysis when we work with documents. You also find analysis in the sense of looking at network analysis, conversational analysis, when we are interacting with people. And when we go through these ways of analysis, they are also theoretically informed. When you see, content analysis, for example, content analysis can be done through quantitative and qualitative methods. That is, I'm talking about two different traditions, which are also having certain, locations in disciplines, particular disciplines. But also there are theoretical uh, traditions through which this analysis are carried out. Now, say, for example, if somebody is doing semiotics, or somebody is doing a discourse analysis, or someone is doing a conversational analysis, they all come from different, theoretical traditions and institutional practices located in a particular place or a particular time. And that's why, when we look at how theories are informing ethnographic data, there are at least three ways. I mean, you can actually think of further modalities. One is that, one discovers theory from the field. That's what, this is a perfect example, is Glaser and Strauss' way of looking at how grounded theory, grounded theory can be brought in as part of, ethnographic presentation of ethnographic data. This is basically talking about going to the field without any baggage or tradition of or theoretical tradition that is in or a pre-given theoretical understanding, rather than theories waiting to be gathered from the field. All empirical or ethnographic research cannot get into theoretical discoveries. So most uh, ethnographic presentation and analysis would entail something called theoretical extension. This theoretical extension is actually transposing or extending an already existing theoretical property or a theoretical postulation to another context. That's how you will find how mostly when we talk about structural functionalism or Marxism or feminism, they all some or the other way have actually started in the Western context. And you will find that theories, normally you will find the location of theories in France, Germany, Britain, or the United States, and that's how when theories are actually extended. When we talk about critical theory or critical race theory or feminist theory, we'll find that how this has been extended, and then you will find these extension as when we are talking about regions or nation states or particular cultural context, you will find something called feminism, which is understood to be a Western white world transposition is taking place. And at the same time, you will find at the third level of looking at theoretical engagement while presenting ethnographic data is about how theories can be modified or theoretical modification can be found. This is called the idea of theoretical refinement. In some sense, you have theoretical discovery, that is somewhat a grounded theory. You have theoretical extension, that is transposition into or or transferability of theory from one place to the other, one region to the other, one cultural context to the other. Theoretical refinement talks about how theory can be, when theory is applied to another context, how theory can be modified in a different place. That's why you will find when Althusser finds the possibility of addressing a historicity as a possibility of bringing structural analysis into Marxism. That's how we find something called structuralist Marxism or structural Marxism. So you will find several such anchorages when theories are reformulated or refined or taking into or getting into a transformative understanding of how theory, when it is applied in another context, we get something, an excess of it. So now, when I was talking about these traditions of theories and concepts which are, deployed while analyzing ethnographic data, I mean, similarly, you can actually think about the question of, how concepts are again informed. Concepts generally become keywords in most ethnographic research. You will find uh, concepts like Foucault's power or Bourdieu's habitus or cultural capital, uh, or even concepts which are coming from classical sociological anthropological theories or political theories, and also concepts which are developed much later. So you will find sort of negotiation with concepts, how concepts can be brought in. So these ideas of, or these this set of practices where theories and concepts are embedded in the presentation and analysis of ethnographic data, that assumes that there is an acknowledgement of theory or theoretically informed ethnographic data. There's also the role of the researcher's own subjectivity or researcher's own role. So how do we understand researchers' own role of taking these questions of rather than the presentation of a particular event or a phenomenon that is observable phenomenon in a field? How do we take this as the presentation and the analysis that is located in subjective orientations, and when we are trying to uh, understand social reality as somewhat close to its truth. And when Clifford talks about partial truth, it is not simply the impossibility of the complete truth. You will find in one of those chapters where Vincent Crapensano in the same volume talking about Hermes' dilemma. Hermes is the god, the interpreter god. Hermes' dilemma begins with Walter Benjamin's reference, where Benjamin was talking about translation or translatability of cultural events. When he talks about translation, Benjamin says that every translation is provisionally coming into terms with the foreignness of culture. So when we are talking about foreignness of the culture, the interpreter makes the opaque clear. It makes the the ambiguous intelligible, and that's how the interpreter's task is to tell the audience how much it can be revealed. Now, the process of revealing something also depends on how much you know and what is the limit of your knowledge. And that's why when we look at ourselves as researchers, we need to understand. That's why I'm in the beginning I talked about. I do not want to offer a particular set of ideas which are in the form of a blueprint, which are in the form of prescriptions that these are the ways in which ethnographic data should be presented and analyzed. Rather, I would talk about how one can understand one's own limit as a subjective researcher, a researcher as a cultural being. I stress on this idea, researcher as a cultural being. So when we look at our own selves and our own ways of approaching a research subject, all of our interests in doing or examining a social phenomena as part of our research, they have something to do with our core subjective experiences or identities, and there's nothing wrong in it. And the problem I'm trying to say is that whether we are trying to acknowledge that, why, I mean, this is a kind of a discourse analysis of one's own self, in the sense that why I have been informed or attracted through different a particular theoretical orientation rather than others. Since we are all hooked by certain theoretical traditions, certain scholars, and certain institutional practices, and certain ways of disciplines or disciplining ourselves or not disciplining ourselves. Now, these ways of looking at ourselves as researchers belong to particular culture. Now, when I'm talking about cultural beings, it involves all kinds of identities. Not I am not really talking about one particular identity of religion, class, or region, language, or gender, or anything as such. They are all these are all not really competing categories. No, they are all categories which are interwoven in such a way that at times we tend to ascertain certain modes of our own identities, and that's how when being a woman going to a field, being in a religious identity going to another field, it all depends on how this is what I was talking about, the fourth convention that I draw from Clifford. It's about how politically ethnography is actually constructed. So when we are talking about politically, we are talking about the 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 authoritative sort of a representation that the researcher can actually offer and the researcher can actually claim. And this authority comes from where and how you are actually located in your field. Now, suppose, whether you are an insider or outsider, how much you are an insider, how much you are an outsider, it depends on, I mean, insider and outsider means that, where your cultural location and the cultural location of the other whom you are going to research, unless and until you are doing a research on your own family, community, and neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So every research field will offer certain kinds of imbalances or unevenness by looking at the identity of the researcher and the identity of the research subjects. So when we talk about this process, we are trying to see that there is a subjective intellect that involved in uh, making uh, an attempt to analyze cultural phenomenon as part of the researcher. There is this subjective intellect I'm talking about. There's also, subjects are in action with different levels of intellects and different levels of orientation. How do we get into some sort of a dialogical process through which we can actually analyze that? So the analysis, that's why I'm actually stressing on the analysis of ethnographic observation. It's not simply about how you analyze the people whom you are studying, analyze their sociabilities, analyzing their ritual processes, or analyzing any other socially significant events. These analyses also ideally be juxtaposed by how your orientations actually matter. The orientation is mostly personal, subjective, as well as institutional. Also, how in and out of disciplines, how you belong to that disciplines by carrying the conventions or not really carrying or adhering to those prescribed ways of doing research. So ideally, we are talking about how the researcher is involving theoretical and conceptual propositions while understanding one's own data, one's own observations and interviews and conversations, documents, through whatever modalities you collected that data. It's all about knowing the data. I mean, it's not simply collecting and presenting an analysis. Knowing the data is important. How you are actually trying to know yourself as a researcher and what kind of orientations that is involved with theory and concepts are engaged in the way in which you are trying to analyze. So now, let's see. I mean, there are several ways of, as I mentioned, analyzing the same set of data. Say, for example, you can approach through a semiotic analysis that will be informed by structuralism and post-structuralism by and large. And you will also find uh, tropes of you wanted to make a kind of generally you will find post-colonial lens, feminist lens, or Marxist lens, or post-Marxist lens. So different ways in which analysis is informed by theory. So otherwise, how we can take into account of our analysis in a vacuum, it's not really possible. So one has to look at how I am oriented through theories and concepts, through specific institutional structures, and also disciplinary frameworks. And that's why when we look at ethnographic presentation, that it is not necessarily that ethnography ideally stemmed from this discipline called anthropology, traversed into disciplines like sociology, political science, and other social science disciplines. But when we are talking about concepts and theories, not necessarily stem from the same discipline where ethnography actually originated as a practice of studying other cultures. So what I'm trying to suggest two things is that one is how one can actually look at and explore the possibilities of concepts and theories through different modalities of theoretical discovery, theoretical extension, or theoretical refinement, that is modification. Secondly, how much one can actually look into one's own subjective orientation as a researcher, and what limits you, and what are the borders of your uh, analytical scope, or how you frame your analysis burdened by these subjective, institutional, and disciplinary orientation. So how you navigate uh, along with this convention that I was talking about. It is important to know these conventions. Knowing the conventions of how my ethnography has been analyzed and presented. Say, for example, how much it is contextual, how I understand the contextuality of my production of ethnographic data, how much I understand the way in which I use rhetorics in the form of expressive tropes, metaphors, allegories, figurations, how much I am uh, disciplined by an institutional structure, whether I am going along with the institutional conventions, I'm going against, or I am trying to resist those institutional conventions, how much institutional setting is informing my work, or uh, orienting my work. Fourth, I was talking about how much the political authority, how much authority that I exercise when I'm trying to talk about other cultures or on my own culture. So how would you understand the positioning of the ethnographer as a uh, political as well as a cultural being? And fourth, you have to understand, one has to look at how all these conventions are undergoing certain shifts, and how these shifts can be accommodated in one's own analysis. And that's why we have moved from ethnographic way of presenting data, from a positivist, Malinowskian way of positivist uh, uh, a positivist mode of observation. Then you will find in the 1970s and after, you will find uh, observation based on interpretation. That's what Clifford Gates is calling a thick description. Merely the scientific observation from a Malinowskian or a positivist perspective will not be sufficient for understanding the nuances of cultural phenomenon. That's why Gates is calling for understanding culture as a text that is a communicable text. And that's how interpretation and hermeneutics, it's this reverberances you will find in other disciplines as well. You'll find phenomenological sociology of Schutz and others. Then you will find some sort of a turn that is taking place in social theory in the 1980s. There's the visual turn, there's the cultural turn. And then you will find in the 90s there's a turn towards embodiment and materiality. And there is a turn in the 21st century that we call the multisensorial turn in understanding ethnographic data. And also, you will find new coinages when COVID stopped fieldwork. COVID literally did not allow us to go and have a sustained and direct contact with people. And you will find new coinages like patchwork ethnography, ethnography from a distance, telephonic ethnography, so on and so forth. So one has to understand the trajectory of ethnography as a convention while looking at its practices. Also need to look at how theories and concepts are informing our analysis, and lastly how one can look at one's own subjective, ideological, and institutional predilections through which we arrive at, or we choose certain modes of analysis. So all these what we can call a reflexive understanding of what the field is doing and what we are doing with the field, a kind of a dialogic exercise would essentially help us to figure out beyond the universalistic, uniform categories of doing research, especially when we talk about presentation and analysis of data. We need to go beyond these formative sort of principles of how ethnography can be done through a particular blueprint. So that's why my provocation in the beginning, when we talk about mm, a, through a growing number of workshops and training programs which actually facilitate, I'm not really critically suggesting that these workshops should not be done. You don't need to take it in that way. All I'm trying to talk about is methodology workshops can be supplemented with workshops on concepts and theories. And there is a growing distance from ethnographic data presentation and analysis at the cost of distancing it from theoretical and conceptual orientations. The best example that you will find in PhD dissertations, in generally talking about it, I have heard several times people in social sciences, scholars who talk about, there are chapters, like there are theory chapters, there are empirical chapters, and there won't be any merger. That is something that we are going through a crisis that Robert Merton would say that this is an extreme end of producing sociological or anthropological knowledge, that you have an abstract set of theories which are not having any connection to empirical reality. There are crude empirical description which are not really having anything to do with theoretical or conceptual orientations. How do we make a kind of a mutual ground through which both theory and the empirical can be interacted with each other and informed by each other? And that's how the analysis needs to be made. And towards the presentation of ethnographic data. So I will conclude here, and probably I'll be able to, because I had to rush through, because you understand that, that's why I told you about the challenge that, in 45 minutes containing all these issues slightly challenging. That's why I had to rush, and in between I could see some uh, you know points you are actually sharing in the chat box, where I was not in a position to uh, go through all these suggestions or comments. But I would urge you, those who are having very pertinent questions, you raise your voice, in the sense that you speak, unmute your mic and speak, so that others can hear, and also I can actually quickly and make your questions very sharp and brief, so that we'll save time. And once again, I hope I could do some justice to the topic. And thank you so much, all of you, for listening.
Thank you, sir, for such an insightful and detailed session on ethnography and field analysis. Yes, as you have seen, we have a few questions.
Yeah,
Shall I read out to you
yeah, that'd be better,
very
Maureen. Yeah,
shortly?
yeah,
Sir, I can't hear you. I
yeah.
think
Can
you're
you hear me?
muted.
Can you hear now?
Just a minute, sir.
Yeah,
I'll just. Okay, sir. I can hear you now.
yeah, yeah. Right.
Yeah, so there is a question. He asked, since today research increasingly relies on virtual and online tools, should ethnography also evolve in this direction, incorporating more virtual methods, or should it remain true to its origins of fieldwork and collecting thick in-person data?
Uh, See, it is not. It's already become like that. I mean, I don't know whether we can actually go back and be in that same old style of doing ethnography. I actually wanted to say that these are how our social life, our economic life, our cultural ways of engaging with everyday is changing. So that way, you will find several. I mean, it all started with internet ethnography some time ago. You will find terminologies like cyber ethnography, virtual ethnography, patchwork ethnography, as I already mentioned. Also something called netnography. Netnography is a recent coinage. I found several articles doing ethnography on the internet. Since we are all having personas of different kind, a virtual presentation of our own self, and there is a real, or physical, or whatever you call, and there's this idea of online and face to face. So we live in these, or what we are switching every day. Our life is full of notifications, and also upgradations through what you do every time. And we are also eager to know what others think about ourselves. That's why we eagerly wait, all of us, when you are on social media and you are having a media mediated life, you're always concerned about what others will be thinking about you. That's why when you make a post of your photo or an event you are participating, within 30 seconds you want to know that whether people are liking it or not. That's how we are actually already moved to that space. So it's always important to look at that side. So I'm not really saying that you completely shift into the virtual world. You have to understand the virtual world, how human life is anchored through as a virtual phenomenon. But also other time we are all real, living beings in other. So it's a kind of an constant mediation through which we are all operating our everyday life. So ethnography has to reach in that space as well. Ethnography also has to do justice, what. So you need to understand both in distinct ways. I'm not really saying one has to replace with the other, or you have to go back to the other. It's not possible to go back. If you want to work, as an example I would give you, that if you are, suppose you want to work on, like, WHR rivers came to India a long time ago, the first decade of 20th century, to study the todas of Nilgiri. Now, if you want to study some communities like that, say for example, want to study Todas of Nilgiri, or you want to study the Trinidadian youth. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that Daniel Miller has worked on the Trinidadian youth, not by studying them in real terms, but studying them how they are using Facebook, how they are, I mean, that's what in Tales of Facebook, when Daniel Miller published it in 2010. It's all about how the virtual world is constructed by the Trinidadian youth. So likewise, you will find Todas of Nilgiris having a very significant virtual presence. So that's what most communities, whether they are doing or others are doing. So most communities, most identities, all of us are having virtual presence, knowingly or unknowingly. So you have to tap into that. That's my I'm sorry I've expanded a bit more, but I think I'll wait for others' question.
Okay, there is another question by Sri Radha.
Yeah.
She asked about the imbalance in the identity of the researcher and the research. And she asked, how does the researcher build trust rapport with the researched?
Okay. The problem is that you are trying to build with rapport for our own goals, that we have to do research within a period of time. So rapport building becomes essential for the researcher to conduct interviews. Earlier, the idea was the colonial ethnographers had more of an authoritative kind of a space, that mostly people were welcoming the ethnographers. If you look at how urban scholars, scholars from the urban settings go to, first it was from the first world to the other worlds, third or fourth world, whatever you call. Then it was something like the urban and the rural, or the urban and the tribal, or the village ethnographies were predominantly found in most part of the world. But then ethnography shifted to urban spaces. You will find a very interesting phenomena. It's always a power relation works in a hierarchical manner. Say, for example, you look at urban ethnographies, both in the West and India or South Asia, you'll find most urban ethnographies are not really tapping into the question of the urban elites. Urban ethnographies are studying the poor, studying the streets, studying the slums, studying the bastis, including, with all respect to those scholars, I'm saying why this is happening. We wanted to study one dimension of it because others won't trust you. That is the problem. The moment you try to do an ethnography in the corporate world, or in the bureaucracy, or in police or military, or in any other sophisticated modern institutions. Now court ethnographies are being done, but court ethnographies are being done by where the public is actually allowed to listen to the trials. It's not that no court ethnographies are done by taking the life history of judges or other practitioners. I have not seen, so you will find always a power relation between the research and the researcher. So negotiating that, it is beyond what within the frame of research or academia or intelligentsia, I would say. It's all about how within society these categorizing of different identities, different individuals have been found. Based on that, these issues with rapport, trust. And now it's especially, if you go to villages, it's not really easy like 60s and 70s. In Indian sociology and anthropology, village studies were much more smoother than uh, what we can find now. Yeah, I think is much more of an ethical question, but it's also a question of dialogism, that we can why people should trust you as a researcher, that question. And why, if they are not trusting you, why there is no trust? Are we trusting others when they come to research us? So these are the questions one has to ask. I hope I made it clear.
Yes, sir, thank you. There is another question by Sukmaya Lama. She wants to know about patchwork ethnography. If you could just highlight.
Yeah, I think patchwork ethnography is a piece first written by Sarah Pink. I'm right, if I'm right. I think, and many other scholars actually started writing about it. Patchwork ethnography, and patchwork ethnography came in the way of when COVID stopped accessing physically the field. And not only that, we have this idea of the physical distance that we call the social distance. When ethnography has become a kind of a standstill during that period, and before that, there are like the trust issues that we are talking about. Ethnography started, when we are talking about over a sustained period of time. That's why ideal ethnography, demands some sort of an it requires some kind of an intensive connection with the people whom you are studying, and the people also should be responding to that connection. That's why in classical ethnographies you will find that people are staying for 2 years, 3 years in a field and collecting data. Now ethnography is not made possible in that way, so that you have to find how much you can trace it through the virtual world, trace it through as part of social media communities, and also trace it through modalities, basically virtual and distance. For example, instead of how long you can do a telephonic kind of an communication with an informant for a sustained period of time, so that ethnography is also becoming a site of producing things with some sort of an immediacy. And I'm not really in favor of this immediacy, but you will find something a contemporary issue is taking place. Say for example, when the Karnataka hijab issue was taking place, within 6 months you will find a volume on that particular issue. And this is what some of them claim, that it's a kind of yeah, I would not say this is ethnographic work, but it is a kind of a journalistic attempt. I mean, that's why the journalistic and the academic way of producing ethnographic data has been actually narrowed down because of this patchwork ethnography. So patchwork ethnography, in some sense, it's a kind of a journalistic attempt, and it won't be you won't have much time to engage with theory and concepts, so that it will be a kind of but patchwork ethnography becomes, or it necessitates that you have to produce ethnographic research. And without naming scholar, you will find that somebody has written an article on, in when COVID started, the transportation was actually was in a standstill, and from Delhi, migrant laborers started walking back to their hometown, the long you know miles and miles they were walking to get back to their hometown. And before they reached their hometown, there's an article published in an anthropology journal called so this is a kind of a patchwork ethnography. Whether how much it is ethical, how much it is intensive, how much it is analytical, we won't be able to. It's a kind of a rapport. You are doing a reporting. Yeah, that's what I would like to tell about that patchwork ethnography.
Thank you, sir. There are a few more questions, but if you have the time, can we take just two more?
Yeah, you read out all the questions, then I will be able to summarize in one go. Is that fine, Dr. Maureen?
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
So I'll just read out. One question is by Tanya. She asked, sometimes the theories do not match the empirical evidences and concepts found in the field. In such cases, finding a Mertonian middle range is challenging. What are your thoughts on it? And another question is, how much is participant observation an indispensable part of ethnography research? Can we do justice to ethnographic research in settings where extensive participation observation is not possible due to limitations? You can take this.
Yeah. Okay. The first question is, I mean, yeah, I completely agree that, sometimes certain theoretical propositions, that's why, the beauty of falsifiability, you can always go for, in that occasion, something else comes in. That's why the possibility of theoretical, a grounded theory or theoretical discovery makes it possible. I mean, theoretically, you don't need to find it an absolutely fine-tuned theoretical proposition. Sometimes a concept will evolve. Sometimes a concept will evolve from the field, so that can also be subject to some sort of a theoretical formulation later. And a theoretical refinement will also become possible sometimes if uh, extension is not being and multiple extension of theories will make it into a new product, or something uh, something a distinctive sort of a theoretical anchorage. So one has to, that's why one has to know the data. Unfortunately, what happens, we are all in a stress to go fast, get it published. That's why there is no time that is left with the researcher to sit and think over the data, that what kind of data is this. So that's why analysis, we are not really taking time now. The moment you start collecting the data, by then, you are in a stress to publish it immediately. That's what, my quick answer is. There is ample time to think about, how the grounded theory can be developed, or if the existing theoretical propositions are not working out, or a theoretical refinement is a good option, in the sense that, we are not really looking towards a fine-tuned theory, rather concepts can be evolved from the field. Secondly, participant observation. This is participant observation is a very old idea that Malinowski's time, that we started observing what is happening in anthropology and sociology. Now you'll find that participant observation is not really. Otherwise, it is constrained by the issues of trust, issues of what you call you look at urban life in general. Even in rural areas, the stranger, the figure of the stranger always will figure out. I mean, feature with some kind of a suspicion. And once a person is actually getting that kind of a rapport, gatekeeping is actually done, taken care of, and then you are getting a good access in the field, at some point the trust can be breached, in the sense that at some point there will be sort of a concerns come from some quarter that what you're going to do with this data. So we are living in a time, I think, none to be blamed in that sense. We are living in a time that trust and mutuality are always as a kind of a shaken phenomenon. It's actually, it can be crumbled at any time. So that's what I would like to say. There's no ideal situation to do a participant observation, but if that is possible, that is well and good, because it gives some kind of an in-depthness of how you are being in that field, living along with the participants whom you're studying. Yeah, that's what my quick answer to that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an enriching session. And I also thank the participants for all your questions. And if you have further queries, the participants can also post it in our learning management system. We can look into it later. Thank you once again, sir, for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Maureen and Dr. Gargi, for organizing it in a wonderful manner, because you have done a very wonderful job, that the communication, the sharing, and the way in which the session was organized, and the Q&A, I really enjoyed it. Only the matter was a little more time, 1.5 hours would have made it much more engaging. Yes. And once again, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to see you all. Yeah.
So we'll want you again if we have any other, future endeavors in this.
Sorry, I did not hear you.
So I'm saying we will want you again and again for such
definitely. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.